Are you familiar with the constellations? For those who don't know, they're groups of stars that make up images based on myths and legends. Each constellation is based on Greek mythology. For centuries, humanity has familiarized itself with these imaginary pictures. As an astronomer, I know them all by heart. But one day, I discovered something I never thought I'd find. I found a long-forgotten constellation. It all started when I was on vacation in Athens. I was exploring an old temple and found an inscription on one of the walls. I studied Greek when I was in college, so I was able to translate. The inscription read, "Praise Morpheus, god of pain and madness." I was beyond confused. I've studied Greek mythology and am very familiar with the pantheon. However, I've never heard of Morpheus. The temple was invaded by the Romans centuries ago, so I assumed that the information about Morpheus was destroyed or lost in the chaos. As I searched the ruined temple, I found a star map on a table. I studied the map, admiring its ancient design, when I noticed something off. As an astronomer, I have every constellation and their positions memorized. But there's one more that isn't on any of the star maps I've seen. There's a constellation with the name Morpheus written next to it. What made this constellation unique from all the others was how the stars were positioned. Constellations typically consist of quad shapes and straight lines. The Morpheus constellation, however, is 12 stars in a perfect circle. When I explored the rest of the temple, I found something else. There was an ivory statue of a man with a small fire pit in front of it. He had swords driven through his head, shoulders, and torso. I guessed that this was a depiction of Morpheus. I then noticed where the blades entered his body and understood the constellation's star formation. The stars represent the opposite ends of the swords in Morpheus's body. After doing some more digging, I learned the whole story of this entity. Morpheus was a god that enjoyed making humans suffer both physically and psychologically. Those who worshipped him willingly subjected themselves to torture. They then used their god's power to punish their enemies. Basically, Morpheus's followers were all masochists. The disciples believed that by torturing themselves before Morpheus's image, he'd grant them his power. One example of the cult's extremity was the fire pit in front of the statue. If a cultist needs Morpheus's powers, they'd have to prove their worth by holding hot coal. The amount of time the cultists lasted would match the amount of time they'd have said powers. The one thing I couldn't figure out was why this information wasn't made public. Anyone could have excavated this temple and found all of this as I did. But for some reason, this place was abandoned the day it was attacked. I knew a humanities professor named Professor Hall and decided to tell him about Morpheus and his temple. I emailed him everything I've learned about the god, as well as some pictures I've taken in the temple. Professor Hall agreed that it was strange that nobody retrieved this information before. He asked me to look for more facts about Morpheus. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything outside the temple. Even Google didn't have any results. Before my search, I assumed that the star map and other artifacts were kept in the temple for the sake of preservation. But after seeing the expressions of the locals I've questioned, I realized that there's more to this than I thought. For example, when I asked a librarian for books about Morpheus, she looked at me as if I were the most horrifying thing she'd ever seen. She even pretended not to understand English, even though she greeted me in that language when I'd approached her prior. That evening, I was heading back to the hotel I was staying in when someone stopped me. A woman wearing a hoodie came to me with a satchel. She heard that I was looking for information on Morpheus. The stranger handed me her bag, saying that everything I needed to know was in there. I opened it and saw a few scrolls, a dagger, and a small figurine of Morpheus. I looked up to thank the woman, but she was gone. When I got back to my hotel room, I dumped all of the satchel's contents onto my bed. I then proceeded to read the first scroll. A sketch of the Morpheus constellation was drawn above some Greek writing. Based on my translations, this scroll spoke of a religious holiday that celebrated Morpheus. It lasted for 6 days, each with its own tradition that only happened at night. The holiday was called Philoponos. On the first night, Morpheus' cult members stood in a circle and held hands while inviting their god to Earth. After said prayer, the high priest or priestess would ask the cult for a willing doorway. The member had to offer him or herself willingly. Once a volunteer was chosen, they're chained at the altar and had a sword driven through them. Morpheus then entered Earth to join his cult for Philoponos. For each night, a blade was pushed through the sacrifice until it looks like the Morpheus constellation. When the last sword was added on the final night, Morpheus returned to the underworld. I don't want to go into the details of what the traditions entailed, as I feel sick just thinking about them. Let's just say that each night involved someone getting tortured, each night with a different method. I didn't get any sleep that night. When I closed my eyes, I could see the bloodshed that transpired on Philoponos. Everything was so real that it couldn't have been a dream. It was so bad that I woke up throwing up on the floor beside my bed. I returned to America and showed my friend the satchel and its contents. Professor Hall was fascinated by Morpheus and his cult. I understand that learning something new in history is excellent for a humanities professor, but this cult was deranged as it was disgusting. Then again, my friend always had a strange infatuation with the bloodiest of historical events. I returned to my regular daily routine after that. I thought that I could finally sleep without having to think of the wretched cult or their god again. But instead, I faced something else that deprived me of peace of mind. About a few months had passed, and I'd forgotten about Morpheus. But early one morning, I woke up to a phone call from one of my colleagues. Before I could say anything, he told me to turn on the news. I could tell by how he sounded that this was serious. So I turned on the TV and was appalled by what I saw. The headline read, "Professor Murders 7. My heart sank when I saw Professor Hall being pushed into a police car. As I watched the news bulletin, I learned that Professor Hall had reenacted Philoponos. The victims were professors of the same field. Professor Hall invited them to his home under the pretense of studying Morpheus. This was a week before his arrest. Suddenly, I remember the dates of Philoponos. I compared the day those professors came to Professor Hall's house to the first night of the holiday. Sure enough, it was the same as the first night of Philoponos. My heart broke when the news said that Professor Hall was going to receive a life sentence. I visited him the first chance I got. When I asked Professor Hall why he did all of this, he told me something disturbing. He claimed that Morpheus told him to do the rituals. My friend explained that while he was reading my written translations, he heard Morpheus' voice. According to my friend, Morpheus wanted someone to revive his holiday traditions. He then confessed to the real reason why he did all of this. About 2 years prior, a student from Professor Hall's university named David went missing. Professor Darwin, another teacher from the same university, claimed that Professor Hall was responsible. David was Professor Hall's worst student from that semester. He never paid attention in class or did a single assignment. Professor Darwin knew this because he overheard Professor Hall complaining to his sister about David over the phone. This convinced Professor Darwin that my friend did something to his student. Professor Darwin even went as far as to have his accusation told on the news. Professor Darwin was the kind of person who viewed everything as a competition. So many times, he tried to prove that he's better in humanities than Professor Hall. The police never convicted Professor Hall due to a lack of evidence. I'm not sure if Professor Darwin truly believed that Professor Hall was guilty. Regardless, the situation deeply affected the reputations of both my friend and the university. Professor Hall never got over what Professor Darwin did to him. So when Morpheus contacted him, Professor Hall saw Philippanos as an opportunity to get his revenge. This was the last time I ever spoke to Professor Hall. He disappeared from his cell the following day, and a week later, Professor Darwin's mangled corpse was found in his house. I don't know where Professor Hall is. What I do know is that Morpheus is real as he is dangerous. Only now do I understand why the temple kept its secrets. I hope that nobody ever follows the traditions of Philippanos again.